At 10:42 a.m. over Wertheim, Germany, the sky looked calm from a distance, but inside the cockpit of a lone P-51 Mustang, it was tightening like a noose. The pilot had just broken through a bank of thick cloud, expecting to rejoin his escort group, expecting to hear friendly voices on the radio, expecting the usual rhythm of a bomber mission. Instead, he saw something no training syllabus had ever prepared him for. Directly ahead, spread across the pale morning light, like a swarm of dark blades, more than 30 German fighters were forming up for a strike. No warning, no cover, no time. In the space of a breath, he realized he was alone below their altitude, inside their kill zone. The radio crackled but delivered nothing useful, only static, only a reminder that his squadron was miles away out of reach, hidden behind the storm front that had just swallowed them. His heartbeat rose instantly, but his hands moved on instinct, throttle forward, propped to fine pitch. The Merlin engine roared a deep chest-shaking growl that vibrated through the seat and into his spine. He felt the aircraft leap, felt the wings flex. Still, the German formation kept coming tight, disciplined, climbing, angling for position to dive on the bomber stream behind him. For one impossible second, he considered leveling out, breaking away, trying to disappear into the same cloud layer that had already betrayed him. But there was no safety there, only blind turbulence and the certainty of being run down from above. The only path left was the path no one sane would take, straight at them. He tightened his harness, adjusted the trim, checked his 6 o'clock. Every move crisp, automatic, drilled into muscle memory through countless hours of stateside training. Yet underneath those motions was a flicker of something raw, a recognition that he was flying directly into a number so overwhelming it barely made sense. 30 fighters, 3-0. Pilots who had survived years of combat, men who had fought Spitfires, Thunderbolts, even Mustangs before. And now they were turning toward him, the lone American silhouette cutting across their field of vision. They rolled into their attack lines. He rolled into his. In that instant, the morning quiet shattered. The distance between them collapsed faster than thought. A wall of silver, black, and yellow nose cones, exhaust trails twisting, sunlight flashing on spinning propellers. No breathing room, no pause. No time to consider what any of this meant. Only speed, only closing angles, only the certainty that the next few seconds would decide whether he lived or whether he vanished into the haze like so many others. I keep returning to this moment when reading the combat reports because there is no hesitation recorded, no note of doubt, only the fact that he pushed the stick forward, committed to the head-on run, and in doing so, chose the most dangerous option available. The option that made absolutely no sense on paper yet would carve itself into the record books as one of the most impossible 6-minute fights of the war. And as the range collapsed to firing distance, as the first shapes sharpened into recognizable wings and fuselages, he knew exactly what he was stepping into. A one-against-many fight he should never win, but he went anyway. Because in the war's final spring on this cold March morning, someone had to stop that formation before it reached the bombers behind him, and he was the only one left in position to try. What follows is how it happened. But to understand why we have to step back from this collision course and ask how a single pilot ended up alone against an entire German strike group. Before we get there, tell me what you think would drive someone to choose attack over escape in a moment like this. He had not started as a legend. He had started as a quiet kid from the American Midwest, a boy who spent long summers staring at open fields and long winters listening to the drone of mail planes cutting across gray skies, wondering how something so heavy could stay in the air. The war pulled him in before he understood what that meant. Training began before dawn, often at 5:30 a.m., the air still cold enough that breath fogged inside the cockpit of the trainer. Instructors barked corrections faster than students could absorb them. Keep the nose level. Watch the slip indicator. Hold your line. Do it again. No praise, only repetition. Thousands of hours of American aviation doctrine hammered into muscle memory. He learned engine behavior before he learned the names of the men in his barracks. He learned to navigate by dead reckoning, first radio compass, later. He learned to shoot not as a burst of adrenaline, but as a calculated release of controlled breathing, a discipline that came from firing thousands of rounds at towed targets while calculating lead angles instinctively, and still something in him wanted more. That hunger showed during gunnery school when he consistently scored in the top percent, hitting moving targets at ranges other cadets failed to track. Ground officers noted his reflexes, his calm under pressure, his unwillingness to break formation, even when turbulence threatened to throw the entire class into chaos. By the time he transitioned to the P-51 Mustang, the war in Europe had shifted violently. American bomber streams stretched across the continent, flying deep into German industrial centers, and every escort mission demanded pilots who could fire, maneuver, and think without hesitation. I find it striking reading the old training reports how little room they leave for doubt. They speak about him not as someone gifted, but as someone relentlessly reliable, the kind of pilot who would finish a mission even if every last system in the aircraft was failing. Yet, beneath that discipline was something more human, a thread of vulnerability that surfaces in letters written during late '44. He wrote about the weight of responsibility, about nights when the engines of returning Mustangs echoed off English hangars at 10 p.m., and he counted survivors by sound, waiting for voices that sometimes never returned. He joked about rations, about the cold, about the tasteless tea, but he also wrote quietly about the pressure of escort duty, the knowledge that one mistake from him could cost an entire bomber crew their lives. What surprises me in these records is how normal he seemed. No bravado, no myth, just a young man absorbing the reality that the war was approaching its final vicious stage. And when he deployed to the European mainland, he stepped into a sky already torn apart by months of attrition. German aces were dwindling, replaced by younger pilots trained in half the hours they needed. American units, meanwhile, were rotating fresh aircraft, fresh engines, fresh supplies. But none of that meant safety. A single mechanical fault at 20,000 feet meant death. A single delayed reaction could spiral into disaster. He flew mission after mission, building a rhythm of survival until March of '45, when a series of weather shifts, radio misfires, and timing errors created the gap that swallowed his escort group and left him alone. And though he could not know it then, everything he had lived through, everything he had trained for, all the pressure he carried from those night returns over England, was about to compress into 6 minutes that would test every lesson carved into his hands. Tell me, when you look at a pilot shaped this way, do you think heroes are born, or do you think they are built by circumstances that leave them no other choice? The German sky he flew into that morning was not the sky of 1940. It was the sky of a cornered nation, a sky cracked by shortages, desperation, and a level of chaos that does not appear in propaganda films, but shows up clearly in the surviving Luftwaffe dispatches. By early '45, Germany was fighting with fragments. Fuel reserves had collapsed so badly that some fighter units received barely enough gasoline for one training flight a week. New pilots were pushed into combat after barely 100 hours in the cockpit, far below what the war's early aces had enjoyed. Yet the paradox is this: even in collapse, the Luftwaffe could still be lethal because the few veterans who remained were concentrated near industrial targets, lying in wait for American bomber streams that crossed the Rhine almost daily. And on the morning of March 24th, the Germans had massed a strike group meant not for him, not for one escort fighter, but for an entire wing of B-17 flying fortresses pushing towards central Germany. The plan was simple: hit the bombers fast, hit them high force, the escorts to scatter, and then drag the wounded formations down to lower altitudes where ground fire could finish what the fighters began. What complicates everything is the weather. A wall of cloud rolled across western Germany that morning, thick enough to swallow whole formations for several minutes at a time. Escort fighters depended on maintaining altitude above the bombers, but cloud banks broke that advantage, blinding radio operators, blocking visual cues, forcing groups to fly on instruments while trying to keep cohesion. One misaligned turn inside that cloud layer was all it took to split a squadron. According to mission reports, that is exactly what happened. A fragment of the escort force drifted off course by a few miles, the rest corrected too late, and he, in the wrong pocket of the sky at the wrong moment, emerged into clear air at precisely the altitude the German strike group had chosen for their assembly. No drama, no cinematic setup, just a perfect intersection of timing. And that is what I find impossible to ignore when reading the sequence of events. Not destiny, not luck. A chain reaction of tiny factors: a radio transmission delayed by static at 10:12 a.m., a momentary realignment inside the cloud just after 10:30, a lead aircraft adjusting trim a fraction too steeply. These things added up. Small elements in one of the most complex environments ever created by war, generating a situation no one intended. And beneath all of this sits the hard truth that the German units he faced were not amateurs. Even depleted, even running on fumes, the Jagdgeschwader group still contained pilots who had survived North Africa, Italy, the Balkans pilots who had fought every Allied aircraft in existence and were preparing for one last attempt to break the bomber offensive. They were angry, exhausted, skilled, and cornered. That combination can be far more dangerous than numerical strength. The German flight logs show they had been ordered to hit the bombers with everything left in their inventory. No holding back, no conserving fuel. This was a final effort to blunt the Allied push before it reached the heart of the Reich. And in the middle of that effort, inside the very corridor chosen for the intercept, a single Mustang appeared like an intruder walking onto a battlefield at the precise second two armies began to clash. I keep thinking about how fragile the geometry of that moment was. If he had been 10 seconds earlier, he would have slipped behind them unseen. 10 seconds later, he would have been drowned inside the bomber stream. Instead, he arrived exactly at the midpoint, exactly where a lone fighter should never be. And yet, through that impossible positioning, he disrupted a German attack that could have torn apart an entire bomber wing. Before we break down how that disruption unfolded, I'm curious what you believe shapes encounters like this: strategy randomness or the invisible pressure of a war in its final violent months. He committed before fear could catch him. The throttle went forward, the Merlin roared, and the Mustang surged straight into a formation no pilot should ever challenge alone. He dropped a few hundred feet, just enough to build the kind of excess speed that turned the P-51 from a sleek escort fighter into something closer to a thrown spear. The Germans saw the dive too late because they expected him to run to break away, to do anything except charge. The first head-on merge happened in a blur. He aligned his gun sight, steadied his breathing for half a second, squeezed, and a curtain of .50 caliber fire stitched upward into the lead Messerschmitt. The German pilot tried to roll clear, but inertia betrayed him. A burst tore through the engine, cowling black smoke exploded, and the aircraft flipped onto its back. One down before a full second had passed. No time to acknowledge it. No time to think. He saw another fighter slicing across his right side, angled to cut him off. He kicked rudder, snapped the Mustang into a brutal climbing turn, rolled left, held the trigger again. The second fighter disintegrated in a spray of aluminum shards that vanished into cloud haze. 2. The clock had barely started. The noise inside the cockpit was deafening. Wind blast, cannon shells ripping past, the howl of the Merlin at redline. He yanked the Mustang into a high G turn that should have bled too much speed, but the dive energy held him, kept him above the stall, let him pivot inside the German formation like a predator suddenly dropped into the center of a flock. A Focke-Wulf streaked behind him, guns flashing. He felt the airframe tremble, felt rounds hammer into the left wing root. The hit pushed him forward in his harness, but nothing vital broke. He slammed the stick right-rolled, inverted, kicked rudder downward, and watched the pursuer overshoot by inches. He flipped upright and fired a burst into the German's belly. The cannon magazine on the Focke-Wulf detonated, sending the fighter tumbling in a trail of white flame. 3. The air smelled of hot metal and oxygen mask rubber. He barely had time to breathe before two more fighters dropped in from above, executing a scissors attack meant to trap him in converging fire. He should have been doomed, boxed in, nowhere to go. And yet he saw a gap, a sliver of empty sky between their firing arcs. He rolled into it, forced the Mustang nearly sideways, used gravity to sling his aircraft downward at a pace that felt like falling off a cliff. The two Germans overshot, separated, briefly exposed. He chose the left one, closed distance, fired. 4. The Mustang wrenched violently as he pulled out of the dive. He could feel the airframe complaining, feel the wings flex, feel the control surfaces stiffen under the strain. He ignored all of it. A Bf-109 swept across his nose at a shallow angle, unaware that he had reversed the fight. He fired a snap, burst a short, brutal pulse of gunfire that caught the German square across the cockpit. The canopy erupted outward. 5. By now the clock was somewhere around 3 minutes, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. Time didn't divide itself neatly in combat. It melted into instinct. And instinct told him he was still hopelessly outnumbered. He kicked back into a climbing spiral, trying to regain altitude before the next wave hit. Below him, above him, all around him, fighters were peeling, diving, turning, trying to bracket him into a kill box. The sky looked like a storm of metal darts. One dart, a yellow-nosed Focke-Wulf, positioned itself behind him with dangerous precision. He felt more than saw the tracking fire. A stream of cannon shells arced toward his tail, each visible as a line of blunt, glowing flashes. He rolled sharply left of, then pulled into a gut-wrenching corkscrew climb, testing the Mustang's structural limits. The German tried to follow but tightened too hard, stalled for a fraction of a second, and drifted straight into his gun sight. He squeezed. 6. The blast of .50 caliber fire ripped the fighter's wing clean off, sending it spiraling downward in a widening cone of debris. Only seconds later, another Bf-109 mine lunged into view, desperate, committed, firing 2 early traces streaking wide. He yanked the Mustang into a vertical roll, dropped in behind the attacker, matched his turn radius, waited for the perfect moment. The moment came. He fired a long burst that walked up the German fuselage, struck the engine block, and bursted it apart. 7. It had taken barely 6 minutes. Maybe a little under, maybe a little over. Even he would later admit he could not remember the exact sequence. What mattered was that the formation had collapsed. Not fully broken, but staggered, confused, thrown into defensive spirals that destroyed their attack timing. And the bombers behind him, the men he was supposed to protect, flew on intact. He leveled out for a moment, just long enough to breathe, just long enough to realize he was still alive, and then dove through a thinning patch of cloud to escape before the Germans could regroup. When I read the gun camera notes and the mission reconstructions, what catches me is how condensed it all is. No dramatic pauses, no slow heroic turns, just a relentless collision of decisions measured in fractions of seconds. A lone pilot forcing a fight meant for an entire escort group, a fight that by every conventional standard should have ended with him vaporized in the first minute. But it didn't. And that forces the question I keep circling back to. How can a single fighter break a strike group designed to bring down bombers by the dozen? By the spring of '45, the Luftwaffe still looked dangerous on paper, but the truth under that surface was crumbling and fast. And the 6-minute clash he survived exposes that collapse with painful clarity. German fighter groups no longer resembled the sleek, disciplined forces of earlier years. They were patchwork units jammed together from veterans who refused to quit and young pilots who had been given barely enough fuel to taste flight before being thrown into combat. Many of those younger men had fewer than 100 hours of flying time, sometimes even less. And most of that was spent trying to keep an obsolete trainers airborne rather than mastering advanced dogfight tactics. The shortage of fuel was catastrophic. Entire squadrons recorded days where not a single training sortie occurred, where pilots sat in briefing rooms studying diagrams of maneuvers they could not practice. Yet these units were ordered to intercept American bomber streams that crossed 300 miles of German territory, ordered to climb to altitudes their engines could barely reach, ordered to fight aircraft whose pilots had quadrupled their total hours. And still, they flew. That is the part I cannot ignore. Even in collapse, even in exhaustion, the Luftwaffe obeyed the command to throw everything into one more desperate strike. The German plan on March 24th was coherent. Climb above the bombers, mass in one large concentration, hit from altitude with coordinated slashing attacks, break the escort screen, carve open the bomber formations. It was logical, brutal, designed by officers who had refined these tactics through years of experience. But none of that planning accounted for the internal decay. Engines that failed under high power climbs, radios that crackled or cut out entirely, ammunition shortages that forced pilots to conserve fire in engagements where Americans could sustain long bursts of 50 caliber rounds. When he dove into their path, the Germans reacted the way trained pilots react. They attempted to break him, overwhelm him, absorb him into their formation, and crush him with sheer volume. But the formation was brittle. Each section had its own problems. Some pilots were too inexperienced to adapt to his aggressive style, others too cautious, aware their machines could not sustain prolonged high-G maneuvers. The fragile glue that held the formation together simply tore as he forced rapid altitude changes, forced them to maneuver hard, forced them to expend the limited speed advantage that they still claimed. Speed was the only realm where German fighters could reliably outperform the Mustang in brief bursts. But speed is not infinite. Once spent, it has to be rebuilt, and rebuilding requires time and altitude, neither of which they had. And then there is the deeper truth that emerges from the after-action reports. German aircraft might have still been fast, still been deadly, but the Luftwaffe as a system had lost what mattered most: time training and the ability to replace what it lost. American pilots rotated through structured rest cycles and maintenance crews with standardized procedures. German pilots rotated through funeral shortages and improvisation. When he shattered their attack timing, he didn't simply survive. He exposed how thin their margin truly was. The German strike mission failed because a formation built on numerical strength collapsed the moment its timing slipped. They had no fuel to climb again, no reserve pilots to regroup, and no depth left in their system. And I keep returning to a single uncomfortable thought. If this same interception had occurred in 1940 or even early '43, the outcome would almost certainly have been different. The Luftwaffe then could have swallowed a lone Mustang whole. But in 45, one determined pilot flying at the edge of control could break an entire strike group because the Luftwaffe had already been hollowed out long before he ever saw them. That is what war does when it stretches too long. It drains institutions until one more push, one more sortie, one more morning. Sky is enough to break them, and yet the numbers alone do not tell the full story. What he accomplished was extraordinary, even against a depleted enemy. 7 aircraft destroyed in 6 minutes is not explained by attrition alone. It came from training discipline and something harder to quantify, the refusal to yield in a moment designed to annihilate him. Before we move to what happened after the guns fell silent, I want to ask you something. Do you think numerical advantage holds any meaning when the quality of a force has already been carved away by years of grinding warfare? Or does the war's final stage always belong to the side that can still think, adapt, and endure? He did not feel victorious when the last German fighter fell away behind him. He felt the shaking first, a deep vibration running through the Mustang's frame, the kind that tells a pilot something structural has been pushed too far. The left wing had taken hits during the chase. The trim tabs were no longer responding cleanly, and the control stick fought him like a living thing. He eased the throttle back, not too much, just enough to keep the Merlin from tearing itself apart after running near redline for so long. The sky around him was suddenly empty, as if someone had reached out and erased the battle with a single sweep of the hand. A few drifting trails of smoke, a scattering of debris, nothing more. He checked his panel, oil pressure low, coolant temperature high, ammunition nearly gone. He could feel his breathing tighten inside the mask, the shock setting in only now after the danger had already begun to fade. The human mind works like that in war. It delays the impact until the body is safe enough to understand what almost happened. He turned west. The horizon was a flat silver band, the kind pilots learn to trust even when their instruments shift from turbulence. He scanned for friendly formations. Nothing. He called out over the radio. Static, then a faint, distant reply, then silence again. He was not out of danger. A damaged fighter alone behind enemy lines is still a target, still vulnerable to flak guns, still at the mercy of a single mechanical failure. He descended slowly, step by step, the way instructors had drilled into him years earlier. Do not rush, do not panic, fly the airplane. It was past 11 a.m. when he broke through the lower haze and saw the patchwork of fields that meant he was crossing into safer airspace. He felt a sudden, irrational tremor in his chest, as if the sight of friendly territory loosened something he had held too tightly. He kept flying. The minutes felt longer now than the entire 6-minute battle. When he finally reached the forward airstrip, the controller on the ground sounded startled. They had counted him missing. They had assumed the worst. He entered the landing pattern cautiously. The Mustang's hydraulics were sluggish, maybe damaged, maybe just exhausted. The wheels locked into place with a heavy clunk he could feel through the rudder pedals. He flared gently, touched down, rolled longer than he should have, until the aircraft finally shuddered to a halt. And then there was silence. No engine noise, no gunfire, only the ticking of hot metal cooling after the hardest flight of its life. He opened the canopy and climbed out. His legs almost buckled. A crew chief jogged toward him, stopped mid-stride when he saw the state of the airframe. Wings pocked with holes, paint scorched, control surfaces torn. 700 rounds fired. The man looked from the Mustang to its pilot and asked the only question that made sense. How many did you get? He answered quietly, as if speaking too loudly might break the fragile reality of his survival. 7. The crew chief stared. Not disbelief exactly, but something deeper, a stunned recognition that this young pilot had returned from a fight he had no right to survive. What he did next reveals more about him than any combat report. He walked to the tail of the Mustang, sat down on the ground, and took off his gloves. His hands were trembling so violently he could barely lace his fingers together. Combat footage does not show this part. It does not show the shaking or the hollow exhaustion that follows an impossible victory. But in the fragments of his letters, in the testimonies of men who saw him that morning, you can sense the truth. Heroism is quieter than legend suggests. It often looks like a tired pilot sitting in the shadow of his battered aircraft, trying to understand why he is still alive when so many others were not. Before we move into what the records say about how this battle was remembered, let me ask you something. When a pilot walks away from a moment like this, is the victory measured by the number of enemies destroyed? or by the simple fact that he lived long enough to touch solid ground again. History did not record those 6 minutes as loudly as you might expect. In the official mission summaries filed that afternoon, the engagement appears as a brief notation, a simple statement of aircraft destroyed, altitude, position, confirmation, pending. Clinical language stripped of the violence it describes, but the moment word reached the intelligence officers, something shifted. 7 enemy fighters downed by a single Mustang in a matter of minutes was not just unusual, it was unprecedented in the final months of the European Air War. A period defined by chaos, attrition, and the slow grinding collapse of the Luftwaffe. Yet even then, even with witnesses, even with gun camera footage, the magnitude of what happened did not fully register until the next day when German loss records intercepted through reconnaissance confirmed the exact number of aircraft destroyed in that same corridor of sky. Cross-checks, serial numbers, tail markings. The evidence converged with a precision that surprised even the analysts. 7 destroyed all within the window between 10:42 a.m. and 10:48 a.m. The documentation was airtight. The meaning took longer to understand. What he had done was not just a feat of skill, it was a rupture in the logic of the battle. A lone fighter was never meant to break a full strike group. Escort doctrine assumed teamwork, mutual defense, numerical balance. And yet here was proof that, under the right conditions, one pilot could shatter the timing of an entire formation, derail a coordinated attack and force a mission to unravel before it had even begun. I keep thinking about the moment the German strike fell apart. Not visually, not as wreckage spiraling toward the earth, but as a failure of cohesion. They lost seconds, then altitude, then synchronization. Their attack never reached the bomber streams it was designed to destroy. And that matters more than any tally. Because in March of '45, every bomber that reached its target accelerated the collapse of the German war machine. That is the strategic weight of those 6 minutes. A single disruption multiplied across thousands of lives, thousands of working hours, thousands of remaining industrial assets inside a nation already breaking. But strategy alone does not preserve a moment. People do. Over the years, commanders, mechanics, squadron mates, even bomber crews he never met repeated the story in their own words. Some described him as fearless, others as impossibly calm. He rejected both labels. When he was asked, decades later, what he remembered most, he mentioned none of the kills. None of the maneuvers, none of the danger. He spoke instead about the quiet after landing, the shock settling into his bones, the awareness that survival in war is a narrow door that can close just as easily as it opens. And perhaps that is why his story lingers. It refuses to become a simple tale of numbers or heroics. It is a reminder of how thin the line is between catastrophe and miracle, between a sky filled with enemies and a runway waiting for wheels to touch down. It shows how a single human being, trained and disciplined, yet vulnerable and afraid, can alter the fate of an entire formation without ever intending to carry such weight. The Mustang he'd flew that morning would be repaired and sent back into service. He would fly again, fight again, and survive the war. But the 6 minutes over Wertheim remained the defining pulse of his combat life, a moment where impossibility cracked open just long enough for him to pass through it. And now that you've followed the story from the first dive to the final landing, I want to hear your view. What do you believe this moment represents? Tactical brilliance, structural collapse, or the raw, unpredictable human force that sometimes decides battles more than strategy ever can?